Good morning. This month is Black History Month here in America, a time for us to look back and celebrate many of the influential Black members of our community who have helped to shape us and influence our society, who've helped to lead us and make this world a better place. It's had me thinking over this last week about one of those influential leaders in the early Methodist movement who was a Black man, and that was Richard Allen. Richard Allen was one of the first of two Methodist ministers who were Black here in the United States. Richard Allen was licensed to preach there at St. George's Methodist Church up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And whenever he got his start there in ministry, he was excited about being a part of the church and serving that community. But it was the white members of the congregation that told him that he wasn't allowed to come and preach or lead in their main worship service. They told him that if he wanted to preach or lead in worship, that he would have to start an early service on Sunday mornings, very early in the mornings. And that was the only time that they would allow him to be able to lead in worship, is to have his own service early in the morning for the Black community. Well, Richard Allen went out and started gathering up members from the African American community there in Philadelphia, started pulling them together and actually started growing a significant congregation there at St. George's, having their own worship service early on Sunday mornings. This part of the congregation continued to grow so much that some of the white members of the church began to feel threatened by them, and the racial tensions really started to rise within that congregation. They were allowed to come to the main worship service. Richard Allen just wasn't allowed to preach or lead in that service. But many of them would still come to worship there at the main service as well. It was one morning back in 1787 that Richard Allen was gathering some of his people together before the main worship service, and they came early to the church that day because they wanted to come and spend time in prayer. They went down to go and kneel at the prayer rails there in front of the altar of the church. And before the service began, then they were going to wrap up their prayer time and head up to the balcony. You see, they had been told that the Black members of the church would have to sit in the balcony if they wanted to come to the main service. The main floor would be reserved only for the white people in that church. So Richard had gathered some of the people together. They were having their time of prayer there at the kneeling rail, when one of the ushers from the church came down front and told them that it was going to be time for them to go to the balcony. Richard asked them, he said, "The service hasn't started yet. Can we finish our time of prayer here, and then we'll go to the balcony?" The usher told them, "No, you must go right now." Richard was so upset about this that day he gathered up the entire group of the Black congregation members, and they walked out of church. They left the worship service that day, and they marched down the street a few blocks away, and there outside they held their own worship service. And this would be the start of Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Richard Allen that day began a new church, Mother Bethel. Mother Bethel still exists to this day. It is still a thriving congregation there in Philadelphia. It was several years after that, in 1787 is when they had the walkout. It was several years later that they really officially became a separate church, Mother Bethel Methodist Church. And it was a few years after that Richard Allen had worked to gather other Black congregations together, and they split off from the Methodist Episcopal Church to form the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was the first all-Black denomination in the United States. And Mother Bethel was the first all-Black congregation within the Methodist Church there in Philadelphia. In fact, still to this day, Mother Bethel is still meeting in that same space that they've held since their early days. It is actually the oldest piece of land that has been continuously owned by African Americans in the United States. Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. I actually had the opportunity to go to Philadelphia a few years ago, and I went to St. George's, and I saw the place where they had been there at the prayer rails. A few days later, we went down to Mother Bethel AME Church, and we actually got to attend a worship service there, and it was a wonderful congregation. We got to learn more from the people there about the history of Richard Allen and this great congregation. We got to learn about what had taken place and how over the years, St. George's and Mother Bethel have now worked together to help promote racial justice and reconciliation in the community. They've helped to work to right the wrongs of the past and to try to bring people together to promote love and peace, harmony and diversity and inclusion. It really was inspiring to hear that message. But as I've been thinking about Richard Allen today, I give thanks for his life and for the wonderful men and women like Richard Allen who have been willing to stand up over the years for what is right, even whenever it is difficult. People who have been willing to stand up and fight for justice. People who have been willing to speak out against the wrongs of sin and racism. People who have been willing to work to make this world look more like the kingdom of God. Richard Allen knew that there should be a place for all of God's children at the prayer rails, at the communion table, and in God's kingdom. We know that since 1787, we've come a long way in our society, but we know that we still have a lot of work to do in order to make God's kingdom come here to earth. We still have work to do to make a place for all of God's children in our communion rails, in our communion tables, in our churches, so that all are welcome and all have an equal place there amongst God's church. This month, as we think back and we remember and celebrate people like Richard Allen, I pray that it would inspire us still today to pick up that mantle that he has passed on to us, to help to love our neighbors, no exceptions. I hope you make it a great day.